I think one of the most important things in being an artist, perhaps in being a human being, but think of it in relation to art, is courage, that you've got to have nerve. You've got to have the courage to destroy what you think is no good and reject it. And the courage to hold on at a certain moment. This is rather hard to explain, perhaps, but there's, I think, the tendency, this is a general moral thing, I think, but it's sort of thinking of it in terms of creation of art, that there's a very strong temptation, if one can do something moderately well, to move very quickly from the moment when you think, well, this is all provisional, this is a sketch, this is not really the finished thing, to then thinking, oh, well, now it's too late. Actually, it is the finished thing. I'll jump from saying it's too soon to saying it's too late. And it's the middle, it's in between these two things. This is the area that you've got to enlarge. This is where the courage comes in, where you've got to say, well, I'm not going to finish this now. I don't regard it as finished, and I'm not going to say it's too late. I'm not going to say it's all run on too far and gone too long. I'm going to hold on to it very, very closely and make it better and think in a way that really hurts. You know, when doing philosophy, thinking often hurts.
Iris Murdoch býr í litlu þorpi Steeple Aston, skammt fyrir utan Oxford, ásamt manni sínum, John Bailey, sem þekktur gagnrýnandi og bókmenntaprófessor í Oxford. Iris Murdoch einn helsti skáldsagna-höfundur í Bretlandi og jafnframt einn fremsti heimspekingur þar. Sérgrein hennar siðræn heimspeki eða moral philosophy. Iris Murdoch kenndi heimspeki hér við St. Anne's College í Oxford í 15 ár, auk þess sem hún kenndi við University College í London og við Konunglega listaháskólann þar. Afköst Iris Murdoch með ólíkindum. Hún hefur gefið út 21 skáldsögur síðan 1954, auk heimspekirita og ritgerða ýmis efni. Iris Murdoch hefur hlotið öll helstu bókmenntaverðlaun í sínu landi. Bækur hennar hafa verið þýddar á mörg tungumál. Samtalið við Iris Murdoch fór fram í London. Miss Murdoch, you have lived in Oxford for over 30 years as a writer and as teacher of philosophy. Do you find the intellectual atmosphere of Oxford a source of inspiration for your writing?
Well, not specially. I think if one wants to be a novelist, one can find one's inspiration anywhere. I mean, people are extraordinary and odd and eccentric everywhere, I think. But perhaps Oxford has slightly more accentuated eccentrics, if one may put it like that, than other places. It's certainly a very interesting place to be. I mean, it's an exciting place because there are a lot of very learned, very clever people all collected together in a small area, and it's intellectually exciting, and I think this does a novelist no harm. But I think that even if one lived as one sees from great novelists like Jane Austen, even if one lived a very restricted life in a sense, one could still find plenty of material to write about.
You mean it's all in your head?
Well, it's all in human nature, and then it gets into your head. I mean, I think people, if you attend carefully to any people, you find interesting things which would inspire you perhaps to write.
Well, apart from Oxford, you also have an apartment in London, and many of your books, in fact, take place in London. What's your relationship with this city?
Oh, well, very deep. I was born in Dublin, but I grew up in London, and I regard myself as a Londoner who lives part-time in Oxford. I love London. It's so big, it's so various, it's so beautiful, and I feel more at home in London really than in Oxford. But it's very pleasant. It's nice to live in two places, and really I live in three places because I live in the country outside Oxford. My home, where I work and live, is in a country village. And then, of course, the city of Oxford is very native to me, and I'm there a great deal. And then there's the marvels of London. So these three places are all good places to be.
As you said, you were born in Dublin but raised in England. Do you feel Irish at all?
Oh, entirely, absolutely. I'm 100% Irish. I'm what's called Anglo-Irish. That is, my ancestors on both sides are people who, Protestants, who came to Ireland in the 17th century. And I belong very much to that world. And I am absolutely Irish in that way of being Irish.
About your books, they are immensely popular in England and read by all sorts of people for amusement. And they are also studied seriously by university people and critics. Is it your intention that your books should be read at many levels?
Intention, perhaps, is putting it too strongly. I mean, art is a natural function if one is involved in it deeply and if one practices it. I mean, it is for me certainly something which I have to do. It's something that I want to do and which I have a very strong compulsion to do. So that the idea of intending in a very precise sense doesn't seem to be in place. It's very spontaneous. But I'm certainly glad that people should read my books and enjoy the story. I am a storyteller. I mean, not every novelist aims to be or in fact is very fundamentally a storyteller. I am. I like making plots and inventing stories and inventing characters. And these are things which everybody tends to like in a novel. They enjoy wondering what's going to happen next and so on. And this, I like that, so that I'm very pleased that people who mightn't be so interested in the intellectual content of the book can enjoy it too.
So you think that people have still a basic need for stories told in words in this age of the image?
Ah, yes. I feel alarmed, though. I mean, I think, maybe a paradoxical moment to say so, but I think television does a lot of damage, particularly, of course, to children who then don't learn to read. I think that that reading and writing and the preservation of language, of its form, and the kinds of eloquence and the kinds of beauty which language is capable of is something terribly important to human beings, because this is connected with thought. I mean, thinking is language. And if you don't have a refined language, if children are not taught grammatical and eloquent writing, then they lose capacity to think. And pictures are no substitute for grammar and for sentences and for paragraphs. I think this is very important indeed, and it may be that, I mean, if one's going to be pessimistic about the future, that we are entering an age when people won't be able to read or write as well as they do now. This is really a possibility and this would be sometimes structuralist writers such as Derrida even somehow picture or suggest to one a kind of situation where the really imaginative people would be an elite, the people who really read difficult books and who were able to invent concepts and invent language. These would be one lot of people. And then there'd be other people who were simply purveying language which they didn't have any creative relationship to.
Now, it is, of course, impossible to say in one sentence what your main theme is after all the varied books that you've written. But it could be said, though, that you have a great concern for the different kinds of love.
Yes, well, I mean, this is part of the human scene, and perhaps the most important part, that people love each other, or fail to find love, or fall in love. I mean, these are human relations at their most fundamental, so that if one's interested in human beings, then one is interested in the variety of kinds of love and love relations which people have.
In your books, Miss Murdoch, you deal with the extraordinary rather than with the ordinary. Does the ordinary bore you?
No, it's rather that I think everything is extraordinary. People, certainly, if one knows anybody really well, one usually is surprised, because people, of course, are very secretive, and people, for many purposes, want to appear what you call ordinary. They conceal their... Well, everybody has thoughts which they want to conceal, but I mean they conceal even perhaps quite simple aspects of their lives and their desires and so on, which when you learn them, you're perhaps surprised. And I think any character is interesting and has extremes. People have obsessions and fears and passions which they don't admit to. It's the novelist's privilege to be able to see how odd everybody is.
Yes, many of the characters in your books, they behave in a mad fashion. For instance, they try maliciously to manipulate each other's lives, like Julius King in A Fairly Honourable Defeat. He has the theory that it's easy to break all human relationships. And your characters, they fall in and out of bed with each other without warning. Brother with sister, father with daughter. So you do see people as quite mad.
Well, you've given quite a list of things here, and they're different things. I don't think people in my books go to bed with each other more than they do in other books. If one thinks about an obsession with lovemaking, many modern novelists have. I think I would count as rather mild in this respect. Of course, these things are important in people's lives. But to take Julius King to begin with, I think he is a unique character in the novels, in that he is totally evil. And there is actually a sort of allegory visible in a shadowy way behind that particular book, A Fairly Honourable Defeat. It's about the fairly honourable defeat that good always suffers at the hands of evil. And Julius is, if you like, is the king of this world. He's the devil. And Talus, his opponent, is a good man, is what in the East they would call a high incarnation. He's a sort of Christ figure, and a very kind of broken down modern one. And these two forces are striving with each other. So that Julius is purposely pictured as somebody who's not really quite a human being. I mean, he's totally concerned with evil and malice, though there are, of course, such persons who are, as we know well, who are destroyers, who destroy all the people around them.
The secret obsessions that you frequently reveal, are they then not only your means of creating characters? You do believe that real people are like that?
Yes. I think that the interior of every human mind, one can't test this statement, is a place of very, very strange things, very deep fears, deep longings, imagery of all kinds, and far more extraordinary than anything that psychoanalysis can reveal. I mean, psychoanalysis is just I'm not terribly keen on psychoanalysis myself. I think I will keep away from it in my own case, and I feel a mistrust of it because it's such an oversimplification, and it's a meddling with somebody's mind, which may do good, but in a way there's so little is known about the minds of individuals that it's dangerous to make quasi-scientific generalizations about them. This, again, is why I think the novel's a very important form, because it's a way of talking about people and about good and evil, and doing it without, not as a scientist, but as a reflective observer, an artist, in fact.
Well, I find your vision extremely comic, and even in the most tragic situations, you cannot help making fun of your characters.
Yes, well, that's like life too, isn't it? I mean, this is an extraordinary... I mean, if somebody from another planet was asking about us, something that one would have to say is, well, we make jokes on this planet, and we make jokes all the time. And in terrible situations, we make jokes. And in prisons and so on, people make jokes. And this is just a natural function of being a human being. So that I think the novelist is particularly close to the comic form because the way he's closest to the ordinary course of life. And one could say that that the novel is essentially comic. It's not tragic. I think I would personally keep the word tragic for, if one's talking about art forms, for plays. Novels are not tragic. They haven't got the density and the concentration and the one point of viewness, as it were, which I think is needed for tragedy. There's always something, I'm speaking of the traditional novel now, in the novel of ordinary life going on, of return to ordinary life or background of ordinary life, and the absurdity of ordinary life and its accidentalness. And everything's accidental, when this is, again, something you'd have to tell the visitor from elsewhere, that our lives are contingent. They're accidental, they're full of chance. And this lends itself to the comic. It's the absurd, it's the unexpected, it's the failure of dignity and grandeur and so on. I mean, it's an interesting fact that tyrants hate jokes. And somebody told me that in an Eastern European country where he was a diplomat, one of the things he was told as a British representative there was, don't laugh in public.
Do you think that the humorous writer runs risk of not being taken seriously?
Yes, I think that certain kinds of writing, and I think mine is one, which is entertaining, I hope, and funny, and storytelling and so on, is sometimes taken less seriously than it should be because it's so evidently an entertainment. So that the more difficult or deeper or complicated things that one's saying in a book aren't looked at because there's enough to look at without looking at that as well.
Of course, there is a great deal of uncertainty about what kind of novelist you are. Do you see this as an achievement?
I don't mind. I mean, so long as I'm regarded as a very serious novelist. I mean, I'm certainly I think of myself as being in the tradition of the English and the Russian novel, the 19th century, great 19th century tradition. I mean, a very minor follower, but belonging to that sort of novel. Those great novels are invariably very funny. People sometimes forget how terribly funny Dostoevsky is because of sort of terrible things that happen in his books, but he's one of the funniest of writers, and Tolstoy's funny, and so is Dickens, and so is Jane Austen, and Henry James, and so on, and so is Proust, whom I also feel very close to. My seriousness is mutatis vitendis, is like theirs, I think.
About your characters, I can never see in your books that you take sides with them. Do you think that the writer is in some ways like an actor who must play all parts?
Yes, whether all one's characters are oneself would differ, I think, in different books, or obviously in different writers. I mean, I identify with a very wide range of my characters who are different from each other, though there are other characters with whom I don't identify. I think, again, this is the kind of book that I write, which is a traditional kind of book, that the author shouldn't be in the book. I don't want to be there. I don't want to be felt to be speaking in my own persona. I'm speaking through characters and different people. And I think in an obvious sense, something which makes art bad is if it's too much a personal fantasy. So I think this is something that artists should beware of, that there is a discipline which is, as it were, the expulsion of yourself and your fantasies from the art object.
And you have said that Shakespeare, your great favorite, he's the most invisible of writers.
He's extraordinarily invisible, isn't he? Yes, and mysterious. Yes, one knows very little about Shakespeare. I mean, one knows something from reading the sonnets, for instance, and sometimes there are revealing things in the plays, but awfully few of the kind of obsessional life that everybody has one, as it were, that Shakespeare had.
Well, he must have had many obsessions.
Well, it's a paradox of art that one's making art out of one's unconscious mind, out of this tremendous energy and power that's in this dark, deep place. I mean, this. I think the notion of the unconscious mind is a profound one. I mean, it's found it's in Plato as well as in Freud, and it's out of this dark, ambivalent place that the power to be an artist comes, the power to invent, the power of imagination. But it's also, of course, a dangerous place. I mean, I would make a distinction between fantasy and imagination. I would regard fantasy as something facile and bad, and imagination is what's difficult, to create something which isn't yourself out of yourself, and to get the power to do it and to go on doing it out of this strange bottomless pit of one's own consciousness.
Would you agree that most novelists have on their repertoire only 5 or 6 characters, that they're really always describing the same people?
Well, that's difficult to answer. I think that if you're not Shakespeare or Dickens or Tolstoy or Proust, one probably does have a limited repertoire. I mean, one tries, you see, one goes on hoping to become better. I mean, this is a perpetual hope, I think, of any serious artist, that suddenly he'll do something which is far better than what he's done before. And one knows what's wrong, in a way, and one tries to get rid of the faults and improve the virtues and so on. I do try to enlarge the circle of my characters. I mean, I know when I'm doing something again. I mean, because I'm ingenious. I mean, artists are ingenious at concealing their faults, and I hope that I do at least manage to conceal or change the pattern of what I'm doing sufficiently for it to seem something quite different, perhaps to be something quite different.
Muddler is one of your favorite words, usually applied to deluded, middle-aged intellectual men. And in fact, the women in your books generally seem to be stronger and more rational than the men. Does this mean that it's just to describe you as a feminist?
Yes, certainly I'm a feminist. That is, I think that women are even in advanced civilized societies are not free, and one has got to fight. The problem is really one of tactics. That is, I don't. I'm not a feminist of a separatist kind. I mean, someone who wants women to gather together and write women's books and develop ideas about female intelligence or sensibility or intuition or anything of that sort. I think that the liberation of women is a matter of women coming out of the ghetto, not inventing another new, jollier ghetto, but coming right out and being everywhere in politics, in the arts, in the trade unions, and in ordinary life. I mean, it's a matter of joining the flow of the human race, which has hitherto been the province really of men. I'm not a separatist. This is a question of tactics, really.
And the reason why your most important characters are men, is it that you see it as a greater challenge to write about men?
No, I don't find any difficulty in writing about men. I hope that my male characters are convincing. In my first novel, which was written with a male narrator, Under the Net, one of my friends did comment. He said, the fellow never shaves. So, you know, there are pitfalls involved. But apart from superficial matters of that sort, I I don't find any particular difficulty in imagining a man's outlook on the world. I don't see why there should be any difficulty.
I'm curious to know what kind of life a writer must lead to be as prolific as you are, having published 21 books, that is novels, since 1954, apart from philosophical books and essays.
Well, I work hard. I live in the country, and I arrange to have a great deal of solitude. That is, I'm fortunate now. Of course, I did a full-time job as a teacher through a large part of the earlier part of my writing life. I don't. I mean, there are problems about time. I mean, there are continual problems about avoiding things which other people want you to do. And this one has to be rather good at, I think.
Such as this interview,
well,
perhaps.
Such as television interviews, yeah. But this is a special case, of course. Well, yes, I mean, I run a house and garden by myself. I have no help in the house. I get a great many letters. I have no secretary. I think that it's easier, really, if I do all these things myself rather than... I'm not a good employer. You know, some people have a genius to get somebody else to do things for them. So that I mean, this is a problem all the time, but it's not a problem that I'm frightfully conscious of, because I don't... I mean, I don't find it... I find it difficult to work well all the time, but I don't find it difficult to work all the time. I mean, I like my work, and I just get on with it. I mean, I'm quite disciplined, I suppose, in this respect.
And do you have a great deal of obligations to people, such as students, or...?
Yes, there's a lot of that. Anyone who's ever been a teacher over a long period acquires very often lifelong obligations. Yes, I have, and I concern myself with quasi-political things. I'm not active in a direct party political way, but I'm involved in things about the position of people behind the Iron Curtain, the dissidents and scholars, people who are persecuted, and this involves me in a certain amount of, I mean, things of that sort, just such as, I mean, anybody would be doing.
In your book, The Black Prince, the main character, who is a writer, says, writing is like getting married. One should never commit oneself until one is amazed at one's luck. When you decided to commit yourself as a writer, did you then have this feeling of luck?
Well, I think it's rather part of the whole operation that any artist has to learn, that you have to reject stuff which is inferior, that one must go on waiting. I find this very much with when I'm inventing a book. I spend a great deal of time inventing the story, possibly even more time than I spend writing it. I mean, that I attach great importance to the detailed invention of the plot and the detailed invention of the characters, so that I can see the whole thing before I start to write the first sentence. There's a kind of primary imagination or inventing, which is really quite out of nothing, that one might do anything. Terrible freedom overcomes one. Then, out of nothing, you begin to make something, perhaps starting with 2 or 3 people in a situation, something more people come, a plot develops, and so on. And this is the very difficult part for me. And I've got to get that right, because later on one can't do it. Once I'm writing the book, I invent things, but they're different kinds of things. I mean, all sorts of funny things appear when one's writing the book. But the deep things, I think I have to, at any rate, to get right at the very beginning.
Are the funny things even sometimes invented so that the writer herself can have fun?
Oh, yes. Oh, well, one's having fun all the time, really. Well, not all the time, because sometimes one is appalled by feelings of inferiority and failure and emptiness and so on, and that, I think, comes to anybody. But I enjoy the funny things. I mean, novel's a marvelous art form. You can do absolutely anything in a novel. I mean, you can bring anything in the world into it, and you can weave into it all kinds of things which are partly irrelevant. I mean, one can have all kinds of accidental things which happen in the book, as it were, where you suddenly diverge from what might be expected to be the path of the story.
Your first novel was not published until you were 34. Why?
Well, like everybody else of my particular age, I ran straight into the war when I became an adult. First of all, I was a student, and then I was conscripted. In fact, the whole course of my life was changed by the war, as was the case with many people. I wanted really to be an archaeologist and an art historian, and that's what I would have done if I'd stayed on at Oxford, which of course I wasn't allowed to do. I mean, 10 days after I finished at Oxford, I was in the government office. I was in the Treasury in Whitehall, and I worked there for 2 or 3 years. And one was working very hard, and there wasn't time, really, and also one lacked energy because of the whole situation. But I did actually write quite a lot, which wasn't much good during that time, which I chucked away. I've always been a writer. I started writing when I was about 9. I really always knew that I wanted to be a writer.
You are, amongst other things, an important theorist of fiction. You do see clearly the difficulties of writing traditional novels today, and yet your position remains anti-modernist. Is it just to describe you as a reactionary? You mean as a fiction writer? Yes.
Well, I'm a traditional writer. I don't think one needs to, as it were, politicize it in this sense, or suggest that one's taking sides in an unusual way. I mean, I'm just staying in the tradition. I think the people who depart from the tradition should be apologizing for themselves. In fact, there's no need for anybody to apologize, because the novel is a free country. You can do all sorts of things in novels, and there's no one way of writing a novel. I just happen to prefer the traditional way. And I think that one needs a good excuse to give up characters and stories. I mean, if you're going to write a novel which abandons the traditional merits, the things which make novels interesting and incidentally readable, you've got to be doing something else instead, which is good.
Can you tell us about the difference between the activities of writing fiction and writing philosophy?
Oh, well, they're absolutely different games, absolutely. I mean, they only connect in a, I suppose, at a deep level, in that I'm interested in morality and in religion and in how people make decisions and their motives and so on. And that would be on both sides of the picture, that I would be interested in this as a novelist and as a philosopher. And in philosophy, I am interested in moral philosophy more than in other kinds of philosophy. But the whole method of writing is quite different. Philosophy is much more difficult. It's a terribly, terribly difficult occupation. It's almost impossible, really. It's contrary to nature. Whereas storytelling is immensely natural. Everybody is a storyteller. Everybody tells stories every day and invents things. I mean, you go home and you very slightly jazz up the incident, which was so amusing, and so on. Whereas this abstract thought, I think, is very, very hard. It's very difficult to do it well. And the whole prose style and the whole use of language is a kind of impersonality about philosophical writing.
So, in other words, writing fiction is more fun?
Yes. Yes, I mean, I am, at the moment, I'm writing quite long philosophy text, and I do that in the early morning when my head's clear. And then it's with relief, I must confess, that I turn to fiction.
As a moral philosopher, Miss Murdoch, you have written much about the concept of goodness. In fiction, however, it seems to be difficult, if not impossible, to write about good people. Are they uninteresting?
Well, that's it. It is difficult, and it's an interesting difficulty. Plato said that it's difficult to portray good characters, because good people are stable and calm, and bad people are unstable and violent and exciting. And this is roughly true, I think, that the people who make stories are unstable people who produce confusion and unexpected things and so on. I think Tallis Brown in Fairly Honourable Defeat is my best attempt to create a good character. But then Tallis is made interesting by being quaint and rather confused and rather unsuccessful and so on. I am actually, or have been, writing about somebody who positively is trying to be good. This is a novel which is coming out later this year or beginning of next year, which is called The Good Apprentice, and about somebody who without any religious belief decides that his aim in life is to become good. And then he wonders how to do this. But there again, I mean, it doesn't emerge that one is able to portray this man, though I think he is a good man, actually. But what comes out is how misunderstood he is and how much confusion he creates by attempting to be good, and that's what makes the story. But it's difficult, in a sense, to pay the tribute to really good people that one would like to portray by sort of explaining them. I mean, fiction is very much about explaining things, and this is perhaps mysterious and difficult to explain. Also, I mean, good people tend to be invisible for obvious reasons. I mean, it's the neurotic person that you notice. The waves are coming out. In fact, in some Eastern wisdom says that the really good man does literally become invisible, because these waves are not coming out of him, that are coming out of the rest of us, the waves of self-assertion and will and selfishness and look at me and so on.
Do you think that goodness is necessary for the creation of art? Does a good artist have to be a good person?
Well, I think he has to be good in relation to his art, but goodness is a highly specialized matter. I think one doesn't have to reflect long to see this, that one knows jolly well that some virtues come naturally and easily, and others are exceedingly difficult, and this differs from one person to another very much. And somebody can, I mean, to be a good artist, you have to have gifts of discipline and ideally courage, and patience and understanding, and a kind of unselfishness which makes you recede and the world exist, which perhaps is a sort of image of goodness generally. But then this can coincide with one's being fearfully selfish. I mean, artists very often are selfish because they want to practice their art.
Do you see goodness as equal to being open to other people?
A good person produces a calm atmosphere and space, a feeling of space around them. You're not frightened. I mean, a lot of people want to frighten other people, or inadvertently, because of aspects of their selfishness do frighten other people. But a good person wouldn't frighten people normally. I mean, then, of course, one gets into all sorts of difficulties, saying, well, doesn't a good person sometimes have to fight? And this then introduces all sorts of complexities into the picture. But I would think the fundamental thing is to do with a certain kind of sensibility. And then if one says, well, what about love, which people, I mean, this again is a religious concept, constantly want to equate with goodness. I think that love is very multiform business, and I think that what we normally think of as love is absolutely riddled with selfishness. But I think that there are awfully few good people, really. I mean, I think saints are terribly, terribly rare. But it's important to have the idea of goodness, of saintliness, perfection.